Zoom test.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, the meeting is now being recorded.
Thank you. My name is Mark McLaughlin, and I'm Chair of the Environmental Transportation Advisory Commission. I would like to call the ETAC meeting to order October 14th, 2025 at 4 p.m. We have 5 items on the agenda. This recording secretary will call for, well, let's do a pledge of allegiance. Let's do a pledge of allegiance. Could you lead us in that?
Place your right hand over your heart. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Recording secretary, please call roll and advise if any commissioners will request an excused absence or remote participation due to invoking of their emergency provision physical absence.
Chair McLaughlin,
Aye.
Vice Chair Bayessa,
Aye.
Commissioner Alvarado,
Present.
Commissioner Cheney,
Present.
Commissioner Klein,
Here.
Commissioner Reynoso indicated she would arrive by 5, and Commissioner Vidori requested a excused absence. You have a quorum.
Thank you. Recording secretary, please describe the way the public can access this virtual meeting.
This meeting is being live streamed on the Santa Ana portal, www.santa-ana.primegov.com/public/portal. If anyone would like to provide a public comment, they may do so in person or on the City of Santa Ana portal, same website. The opportunity to speak is going to follow the next comment. If you wish to speak, please select the Zoom hand icon to let us know if you would like to speak. You will be called upon by the name you entered. If any members of the public are present at this in-person meeting, please be sure you have completed a speaker card and then hand it to me. Speakers will be allocated 3 minutes to speak. We will notify the speakers when the time is on.
Do we have any speakers?
We do not have any public speakers.
Okay. Moving on to the consent calendar. At this time, we are ready to vote on the consent calendar. Is there a motion and second to approve the consent calendar?
So moved. Commissioner Klein.
Second,
Commissioner Cheney, second.
thank you.
We have
Recording
received,
Secretary, will you please call roll on for the motion?
we have received a second by Commissioner Klein and a motion to approve the consent calendar. And now the vote. Chair McLaughlin,
Aye.
Chair Biessa, Vice Chair Biessa,
Aye.
Commissioner Alvarado,
Aye.
Commissioner Cheney,
Aye.
Commissioner Klein. The motion to approve passed by a vote of 5-0 with the commissioners absent.
Okay. Business calendar items. Due to scheduling issues, number 5 will be presented before number 4. Business calendar item number 5, sewer services program update. This item is informational. Jose Medina, Senior Civil Engineer, will you please present this item?
Good afternoon. I'm right here. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, members, for allowing me to provide you with this update for the sewer services program. As you said, I'm Jose Medina, Senior Civil Engineer with the Water Resources Department. Today's presentation is going to be on the sewer systems operation. It's going to be a high-level overview of the basic concepts of what the sewer system is and the services that we provide for our community. I like showing this organizational chart often so that you can see where we fit in the big scheme of things. The public, number 1 at the top, who we provide service to, and specifically the sewer collection and maintenance team is there circled in red. We're one of 9 sections of the Water Resources Division. This is our sewer systems collection. It's 9,000 manholes, 2 sewer lift stations, 390 miles of water sewer mains, 48,500 miles of sewer laterals. I'm going to go through each of these individually for some of you that may not know. We'll start with the sewer laterals. At every parcel, whether it's residential, commercial, industrial, there's going to be some kind of sewer lateral that connects the sewer to the main out in the street. So all the water from when you wash your hands, when you flush the toilet, take a bath, all that gets conveyed down a lateral into the mains. The mains, the 390 miles of the main, is the system of gravity pipes that take all this wastewater downhill, ultimately going to the Orange County Sanitation District in Fountain Valley, where it gets treated. Because this is a gravity system, occasionally we need to assist it a little bit. That's where our 2 lift stations come into play here. If you can see there on the lift station diagram, the wastewater comes into the structure and there's a pump. The pump moves all that wastewater up and directly into the OCST mains. And then lastly, the manholes, that's the access point for us to be able to maintain the system. And the next slide, I'll go into more detail about the manholes. Sewer maintenance operations. We provide cleaning, maintenance, and repair of the sanitary sewer facilities, as well as removal and prevention of sewer main blockages. The sewer maintenance program ensures operations and maintenance of 390 miles of sanitary sewer main, CCTV inspections, sewer lateral replacement. I'll go into detail on that on the next slide. Maintenance of the two sewage lift stations, sewer maintenance management plan, and lastly, ensures FOG's compliance with the Regional Water Quality Board. I'll have details on that at the end as well. I always like to provide a picture of what it is that we do. It helps to understand more, and get a better understanding of what services we provide. Here in this picture, but you can see that there's a manhole lid that's been removed. That's one of those 9,000 manholes. And staff there is in the process of cleaning the main. And sometimes in the main, we encounter large objects that we don't want to go downstream to clog somewhere else. And that's where that vertical pipe is for. They suck up all the stuff out. That's one of the many services that we provide. This is our sewer lateral replacement program. It's customer request based. Repair/replace lower lateral. I will describe what that is in a moment. There's approximately 150 laterals that we replace annually, and we utilize traditional and trenchless technologies. I'll go over all three of them in a moment. What is meant there by the lower lateral is the separation of where the public right-of-way begins and where private property ends. Generally speaking, is usually at the sidewalk level. The homeowner is responsible for the lateral from their property up to the main, but this program helps to replace the lower portion of the lateral from the sidewalk out to the street. And there's three methods that we can do this. The open trench method is the most evasive. Somebody comes in with a big saw cut blade and cuts across the sidewalk, cuts across the parkway, the curb, the gutter, the asphalt on the street, all the way to the main. It's the most evasive way. We don't do this very often because there's better ways of doing it. Sewer lining, that's what this picture represents. What we do is at the right-of-way line, we capture the sewer lateral there and insert a new liner into the existing lateral, essentially renewing the service there for future use. It's a good method to do because you're only providing a boring pit on the sidewalk. You don't go into the street. The traffic can still flow. It's quick and easy to do the liners. And the last one is a pipe bursting operation. It's similar to a liner in the sense that we have to have a boring pit, but we put one on either side, one on the sidewalk and then one on the street as well. There is a pipe that gets inserted into the existing one, and as it goes through, it's exactly what it says. It bursts the old pipe and renewing the existing lateral connection. The fats, oils, and grease program. It reduces sewer operations and maintenance costs, prevents blockages that can lead to SSOs. That's sanitary sewer overflows. And there's more than 1,400 food service establishments here in the city. Those get inspected either quarterly or yearly, depending on the type of operation that is being done. I'm going to go through these pictures and they'll help kind of understand a little bit more. So you can see at the top, there is a 3-compartment sink. That's a pretty standard piece of equipment at a restaurant. The best management practices for dealing with fats, oils, and grease that restaurants use to cook is to remove it and throw it in the trash. Unfortunately, sometimes they don't do that, so they end up washing all that grease down the sink. In this situation, what that little gray box at the bottom does, it's called a hydromechanical grease interceptor. What it does is it separates all the grease as it goes down the drain before it goes to the sewer main. Ultimately, somebody will come and pump all that out. The second photo underneath is a similar concept, but much bigger. It's a large, generally 1,000-gallon tank that helps separate the oil, grease from the water. There's compartments that divide it and gives it plenty of time for the water and oil to separate. Think of classic, science experiment when you put oil and water, how they naturally separate. Grease always goes to the top. Well, that device allows that to happen, and it gets pumped out periodically by another vendor. And then lastly, at the bottom, that is a picture of a sewer main. It's partially clogged with that fog. Right now, the water is flowing there, but over time, if we allow that to grow, it will clog that pipe and it will cause a sewer spill on the upstream. This is one of the things that our staff does. They go in there and clean all that off out of the system. But ideally, the best method is to be proactive and try to keep that from entering our system. Another thing I like to utilize to compare this, you can't really picture that, is your arteries. It's the same concept. As you're eating a lot of grease, if they get stuck along your arteries, eventually it'll cause a problem. Same kind of concept here. And lastly, this is the team, rain or shine, no pun intended. They're out there doing the work for the community. I'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you. Do you have any questions for?
I just had two quick questions for you.
Sure.
So when you were talking about the different options for doing the lateral replacements, what are the reasons that you would do the open trench? Like what circumstances would lead you to do that more invasive technique?
Certainly. So if you could think of the pipes when they get installed, they're in little sections. And occasionally, if there's a settlement of some sort and that section shifts or shears off, you can't really throw the liner through it. You have to excavate. Excavating, it's not the ideal method for obvious reasons. I don't want to cause more delays in traffic, inconvenience residents as often as I don't want to inconvenience them more than I have to, but that would be the ideal situation to do an open trench. And we can identify that with our CCTV equipment. We go into the main, and now we've recently purchased a new piece of equipment that can go up the lateral, and we can clearly see if there's an offset or if it's a good candidate for lining.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you for that explanation. And then my second question, first, thank you for teaching me the technical term for a grease trap. I used to work in restaurants. We just called it a grease trap, but now I know it's a hydromechanical grease interceptor.
My pleasure.
But I was just curious, you mentioned the quarterly and yearly inspections for the food industries in the city. Are those performed by city employees, or is this like part of the general health and safety inspections that restaurants receive?
We have a consultant on board that does the inspections. When we first give the permit for the fog, initially we start yearly. That's the bare minimum we do. But we get feedback from the inspector. They'll tell us, well, the grease interceptor actually was above the normal range. Maybe we should do it, every 6 months or every quarterly. And also based on the equipment that they're utilizing, a coffee shop's gonna not produce as much fog as, something that has a deep fryer and, anything that produces a lot of grease.
Great, thank you so much.
Anyone else? I have one question. So the slide said that there are 1,400 food services, but that does or does not include trucks,
That does not include the food trucks.
which is a big population in Santa Ana. Now, where do they dump their grease and their oil and everything else?
I want to tell you that they are doing all the best management practices and
But you're not-
collecting it at the end of the day and throwing it into the trash, but we don't know exactly what they're doing. That's the recommendation that we always tell them, because occasionally we visit those facilities that have the trucks. I don't know if you see them, they park. They all stack up in parking lots. When we do visit, we always remind them that that's what the preferred method is. There is some locations that have a grease trap, or a grease interceptor within the facility, but if they're doing stuff after hours, we won't know until we inspect the sewer main after the fact. And then we do go keep an eye on those spots. If we do see an increase in the fog as it's developing on the main, we'll go back in there and remind them that they gotta make sure that they dump everything properly.
Well, I mean, for many years, we've had restaurants that have had struggles to stay open and things of that nature, because they're complying with, if not all of they comply with all of the requirements.
Mhm.
But then you have the food truck population on the other side that doesn't have to comply and doesn't have that cost associated with it. So it kind of, it's not very balanced as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. If I can have them all permit, that would be ideal. So at least we know who's out there. However, I don't know if we can force them to dump everything properly, even though that's what we recommend. What we tell them is at the end of the day, when you're cleaning up, preparing for the next days, when you go out, take all the grease and dump it out in the trash. Don't put it down the sewer.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Commissioner Alvarado, I don't know whether you would answer this. Does your team know if every sink or like a restaurant requires a grease trap, or is there a minimum amount of grease trap requirements for restaurants?
It depends on the type of restaurant. If you're a heavy grease producer, we would require you to have the bigger piece of equipment, like the gravity grease interceptor, that 1,000-gallon box that I was mentioning. If it's a smaller operation and you only have a couple pieces of equipment that produce that, maybe you can get away with the hydromechanical underneath the sink. Some locations don't have a lot of room, so we have to get creative with what we allow or don't. But we have, protocols and checklists. The restaurants fill out an application and they tell us what they're going to use. Then we go check to make sure that that's actually exactly what they're using. Then we'll give them a permit and we'll tell them, okay, based on the amount of fog that you're going to produce, you need this type of equipment.
Is that process included in the overall building inspection or permit inspection, or is that a separate thing that we do?
When they come to apply for a permit, if they're remodeling or something like that, it's a trigger. They have to come check with Water Resources to get a fog permit.
Thank you.
And just to add in regards to the inspection, it gets done by our planning and building, team.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Jose? Jose, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Moving on to business calendar, item 4, citywide parking study update. This item is informational. Sid from City Traffic Engineering Division will present. Julie Dixon from Julie Dixon Inc. will be present on this item. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Commissioner, Chair, Vice Chair, and Commissioners. I'm Zika Kula with the city's traffic engineering. I just want to take this opportunity just to let you know that you guys are familiar with the parking program. It's a little bit complicated, a lot of competing needs, right? So what we did early on at the very start of the inception of this, we ended up hiring a consultant that has the expertise and knowledge to help guide us through this process. And today, the consultant, specifically Julie Dixon, will be presenting on this item. After the presentation, city staff will be also available to answer any questions as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for having us today. I'm always excited to talk about parking. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I do tend to get very excited when I do talk about parking. It is my life. And so very happy to be here today, especially to report out on the progress that we've been making in the city of Santa Ana. And so again, you might be surprised, a parking consultant, that's really a thing. And honestly, I'm sure you all can appreciate the density challenges that we do have in Santa Ana and the parking challenges that come along with that. I just wanted to share with you, I've been in the parking industry for almost 35 years now. I actually started as a parking enforcement officer back in the good old days, but now work with agencies all across the country, along with, we have a subcontractor, Fair and Peers, who many of you might be familiar with. But I really wanted to highlight as well that we actually work with a number of your neighboring agencies as well. And this is really important because when we do talk about some of the lessons learned, it's not necessary for you to have your own lessons learned, quite honestly, if we can leverage what's happening in the industry as well as in some of our neighboring communities to be able to broker that. And I thought a little side story was my first introduction to your program. I was working on a residential parking permit program in Tustin, and I saw this really big parking lot in the city of Santa Ana, which happened to be your zoo. And I actually called the zoo to see if we could leverage it for a shared parking agreement in Tustin. And I was informed, no, we're going to use that for the city of Santa Ana. So I always thought that was a little fun fact about parking available resources, which we'll talk about as we get into the program here today. So one of the things that Zed highlighted, I think is really important is that you all have a complicated program as it exists today, one that has many layers. It's been built upon policies that have been evolved over the years. So it was really important when we started this project a couple of years ago, was that we really wanted to be able to roll our sleeves up and understand the operational needs for not only the community, but also city staff. I'm sure you can all appreciate that it's really important that we want to ensure that no matter what we do when it comes to parking management, our tagline is parking needs to be easy, convenient, and accessible. And that also relates to the technology. So I think you'll really appreciate some of the directions for some of the initial recommendations, because that's something that we did when we first came into the program, was we really rolled up our sleeves and looked at your operations. We actually went on a graveyard shift and went out on a ride along with parking enforcement to really see, what's happening, under the cloak of darkness for that matter. And also when the sun comes up and see where everybody goes. It's also important that we review your municipal codes, because oftentimes we have municipal codes that are quite dated and quite restrictive. So it was very important that we look at the municipal code. And I'm sure most of you, especially on this committee, can appreciate there are a lot of legislative changes that are happening in California that are very much in particular going to impact the city of Santa Ana, especially when it relates to residential developments. And I'll talk about some of those developments as we get through the recommendations as well, because these will have bigger implications for all of you. And it's going to be very important as we talk about the program moving forward, that we want to be cognizant of those policy changes so that we can make sure that we have an adaptive solution as well. It was really important as we talked about this project was how significant it was to make sure that the community is and was and continues to be engaged in this process. And so we've spent a lot of time on what we call the Public Works Roadshow, where we went out to the different wards, the different districts, and really went out and talked to the community members. We also ran an online survey, which I'll talk about here today too. But it was really critical to hear straight from your community what their actual experiences are as it relates to parking, what their challenges are, because that was really key when we talked about drafting that first round of recommendations and then actually going back to the community. I think you'll find oftentimes in projects or in studies, you'll go out, you'll hear from the community in that first, swath, and then, okay, we're kind of put it up on the shelf and we're done with you. But the reality is, in order to make recommendations that are realistic and viable in your community, it was really important to make sure that the community, that we had heard them and that the recommendations that we were bringing forward were viable and realistic for everybody involved. And so that was really key about this particular project, was to be sure that we were very engaged. And I really have to reinforce, I get to work with cities all over the place. How involved your public works department is with your community was very evident in the community engagement that we conducted. You could tell just from the way that your community members understood and recognized your public works staff that were participating, that you could see that this was not the first time that they had had engagement and conversations. And I just really appreciated that dialogue, because you could see that, this was the next step in the path, but one that the community definitely felt recognized and appreciated. But I want to call attention, especially to the right side of the screen, because you may have seen some of the social media posts that have been done over this last couple of years when it comes to data. So I like to tell folks, especially when I'm talking to the community in particular, that when it comes to parking, everyone's an expert. You drive a car, you park a car, you're an expert, you're an expert, you're an expert. We all have an opinion about parking, right? That's my parking space. That's my block. This is where I always park. All of those factors, right? Those are the realities of parking management. And so one of the challenges is that oftentimes we'll come into a community and parking can be very contentious, and it can also be very political. And one of the reasons why I bring up data is because we want to set up the city to be able to make what we call data-driven decisions or data-informed decisions. So it doesn't matter what my opinion is or that that's my parking space. You know, this is my house, that's my curb, all of the things that we get to hear frequently. It really comes down to the data. And as we talk about the data, the thing that's important about the data is that in the parking industry, the metric is 85%. When you're at 85%, it basically means you're near or at capacity. It's when the city needs to start making parking management decisions. And that's going to be particularly important as we start to look at the data that's been collectively and cumulatively collected throughout this project. And one of the things I'll also jump slightly ahead, because if I start using acronyms, which I hope I won't, if you hear me talk about LPR, LPR is license plate recognition technology. And one of the unique form factors for this particular project is that the city has invested in LPR technology, and we've actually been able to leverage our public works staff to actually go out there and collect the data. So what you're going to see is we have a very comprehensive data set and something that not only creates our baseline for these measures, but also something that we can continue to collect against and measure for. And I think that that's really important because while I haven't come across a program yet that is free of politics and free of opinions or free of perceptions, the more that we can talk about the data, the more intrinsic it is to the value of the recommendations. And so I always like to lay that out at the beginning, because that combined with the community's wants and the community's needs and the community's desires is how you really prioritize the changes and the change management that we're ultimately heading towards. So it's important when we talk about this finalizing the recommendations. What we're here today to do is really kind of provide you with a brief outline of some of those recommendations and to really hear your response and feedback, and then ultimately be able to go to City Council and receive similar feedback as well. But if there's one thing I'd like to highlight to you about parking, is that parking is a living process in every city that we work with. Again, it's where we live, it's where we work. And you're not done talking about parking today. I think that's what's important. A lot of folks would like to have this be a one and done conversation, but with the changes that are coming through our state legislation, with the housing crisis that we're in and the housing element and all of the waivers to parking minimums, we are not done talking about parking in Santa Ana. And so what we're really trying to do is create you with what I will call the parking roadmap, so that ultimately we can come up with the implementation plan of how we're going to manage parking moving forward. So we wanted to just spend a brief amount of time and not really dwell on this, but regarding the existing program, I don't want to really go into it line by line, but what I really want to highlight is just some of the differentials of when we start talking about what is to come. I think it's important to recognize that historically, residential parking permit programs really evolved basically back in the 1950s, when multifamily apartment buildings started to get built in various single family neighborhoods. Oftentimes residential parking permit programs were established to basically keep those apartment dwellers off of my single family street. That's when you look at this from decades old processes. And then what's happened over the years is that you've seen rules and layers be built upon those. And then we've seen many more apartment buildings and multifamily developments being built. And I highlight that because in 2016, California Attorney General published an opinion. Now, mind you, it is an opinion, but many cities chose to reformulate their parking programs because the Attorney General opinion stated that you cannot differentiate between a multifamily or a single family home when it comes to a residential parking program. And that's going to be important when we talk about the recommendations moving forward, is that when we talk about making parking easy, convenient, and accessible, it also means equitable. And I think that that's important, is not distinguishing or differentiating between single family or multifamily, and making sure that everybody has an opportunity to participate in the program. And that's going to be important when we talk about the program moving forward, especially when we talk about the petitioning process. You're going to see that some of the recommendations moving forward is how you can opt in to a residential parking permit program through a petitioning process, and some of the ratios that will change. And also importantly, when we talk about who is eligible for a parking permit today, one of the things that we want to really talk about is, again, where multifamily actually has an opportunity to participate more equitably in the program, and really, again, trying to kind of level the playing field. I'm sure you can all appreciate, as we talk about parking and housing in general, as many of us who grew up in Southern California can appreciate, the profile of what a single family home is today and even a multifamily dwelling is very different than maybe what it was like, you know, when I was growing up. The reality of we have many adult drivers living in the same household, what maybe used to be a 2-bedroom domicile that maybe potentially had 2.5, maybe 3 adults, could ultimately have up to 6 adults in those households. And I think this is important when we talk about that, especially in a community like Santa Ana, many of those people have cars because they're driving to their work. And as we talk about some of the legislative changes that have taken place here in California, we now know that if I develop housing within a half a mile of a transit stop, I am not required to provide any parking for that development. And that's a law that is on the books today, and developments are already being built as a result of that. So this is when you kind of talk about that perfect storm of a scenario where we already have housing, where maybe there's more people than what was originally ideally designed for. And then you talk about new developments coming in. That just means more people and realistically more cars. Now, some would argue for you that the reason for they call them TOD, transit oriented developments, are being designed so that you don't need to have a car. I was born and raised in Southern California. I'm not going anywhere without a car. And the reality of the reliability of our transit, no offense to OCTA, the fact is that our community members are working 24-hour shifts around the clock. And I think we just have to be realistic about the car demands. And so as we talk about the recommendations moving forward, I hope that you'll see that we took your community into account and tried to be realistic in those recommendations. But getting back to the existing program, some of the opportunities that we have for some of the improvements today, some of the requirements require that when you purchase your parking permit, you purchase it in 2-year intervals. It's very much tied to how the system was designed. We were talking to the Director of Public Works yesterday about the fact that you have an in-house permit management system that was designed very comprehensively to meet the needs of your permit program as it has evolved. We've gotten to a place now where it's time to pick up what I will call an off-the-shelf permit management system that allows your customers to self-manage from home, not require people to come into the counter, which we'll talk about here on this next slide, but also to get to, when I talk about license plate recognition technology, to get to what I call a plate-based solution. If any of you have the parking permit, you know that your license plate is actually written onto the parking permit and it's supposed to be affixed to your vehicle. I can tell you from going on a graveyard shift, there's a lot of fraudulent behavior that happens out there. I know, shocking, but things do happen. So when we do talk about the opportunity and expense associated, even with this unique numbering sequence that happens with our permits, these are all opportunities that will become things of the past as we talk about how to move this program forward. Same with the guest passes. Having that physical pass for folks to be able to put into their windshield and to know that those dates are affixed, and knowing that only single family homes are eligible for these guest passes. These are the types of things that we're really looking to modify. And while $89 may not seem like a lot of money to everyone, $89 in one fell swoop can be onerous to many of our residents. So when we talk about some of the modifications that can come to the program, I think that you'll appreciate it. So as I mentioned, coming into City Hall to acquire your permit or submitting your documentation by mail, it is a process that has worked for years. And I don't want to say that it's broken by any means. It's worked. It checks the boxes. But when we talk about where we are today and, you know, this era and this year and how much I usually pick up my phone and say, you know, how much we all depend on our phones and technology. This is something that we're really looking to evolve how we manage this program moving forward as well. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that the parking enforcement for the program today resides in the police department as the program stands. But now let's talk about the future and the direction of where we're trying to head. So it's important to understand when we talk about that AG opinion, the Attorney General opinion, of the fact that we want to make sure that all of our residents have an opportunity to opt into a permit program. One of the things that we made the recommendation to do is actually lower the petitioning process. And most importantly, is also giving both a property owner and a tenant a voting right. That's something that's really important because of the fact that if I'm a long-term tenant, I should be able to vote on the rules associated with where I live and where I reside. So these are important factors when we talk about how that works. I will tell you, in any community that's been able to introduce both the owner and tenants into the voting process, it again is really about equity and participation. So it's been something that's been a real win for the program. And again, when we talk about who's eligible, the opportunity to include multifamily is really important, and we'll get into the methodology of what that process can ultimately look like. Now, this is where we really start to move the needle. We would actually be able to change the cycling process so that the renewal process would be 1 year. The program can also be cyclical so that if I buy my permit on March 1st, it can be valid until March 1st the next year. This is the way that when you talk about the fluidity of off-the-shelf permit management systems, basically brings us to you. You no longer have the need for a decal or a sticker or a hang tag, because in California, our license plates are unique identifiers to our cars. And basically your license plate acts as your parking permit. If you've ever paid for parking in most other cities using your mobile device, most times it's your license plate that is the driver. And so when you start to talk about parking management moving forward, it's really, again, moving you into this current era. And again, the ability to self-manage your account is going to be really the game changer, because your ability to determine your eligibility, use the online account. You can still come into City Hall if that's what you prefer, and you want to come in and, see public works staff or see clerk staff. It's absolutely an option for you. But the convenience of being able to do this process online is one that we're really excited for. I won't even describe to you the efficiencies for how fast it can be, but having worked with these programs in other communities, I can just tell you that you can actually receive permit fulfillment, especially if your vehicle is registered to your home address. You literally can get your permit fulfilled within seconds. And I think that that's just another game changer. Something else that's also an advantage is when it comes to the guest parking permits, is that while we're not sitting here today to tell you, we're telling you there needs to be X number of guest passes by zone, etc. We're right now trying to recommend, or what I will call, the holistic guiding business rules for the program, and getting into the semantics will come through as we make recommendations to how to manage parking permits differently. But your ability as a resident to be able to have your guests scan a QR code, or again, log on to the app to be able to sign up for a guest pass. These are the types of values and benefits that we basically can change. And that 1 year cycle on the permit renewal process is one that we also think is fiscally advantageous for our residents, because again, you're not having to pay up front for a 2-year permit. You can renew on an annual basis, thus bringing the fees down. I should also mention, just since I'm talking about fees here, it also is important to recognize Proposition 26 in California that basically states that cities are allowed to charge for a residential parking permit. It just can't be considered another property tax. And the rate structure has to be one that's demonstrated to be sustainable, where basically the cost of the permit needs to pay for the program. That can include the management system, the staff time, the enforcement resources, the signage, all of those factors. But the city basically develops a financial model to demonstrate that that fee of, let's just say, $40 annually, the cost of times the number of permits basically covers the cost of the program. And I think that's important when we talk about parking management as a whole, is that when you talk about an optimally designed parking program, whether it be residential parking or even paid parking, you want to design a program to ensure that you're covering the cost. And that's really the ultimate goal of any parking program, no matter who sits up here in front of you. That's always the end objective. But utilizing the parking permit program is, again, based on the permit zones that are authorized and approved. You would be able to go online, input your address, and basically find out all of the qualifiers associated with the parking permits that you're eligible for. You can still do things via mail-in. You can still come into the counter, like I said, but I would guesstimate that you'd probably have close to 90% of your customers will utilize the online services. And one of the best parts about that is the automated renewal notices. When, let's just say I did buy that permit on March 1, come January 15, I start getting the email notifications to say, hey, Julie, your permit's going to expire on March 1st, be ready, be sure to renew. So again, self-managed and self-accountable. And I think that those are real wins when we talk about the process and the system. One of the things that we're excited about too is that Santa Ana PD is looking to procure the license plate recognition technology as well. Because the more plate-based that we can go, the more efficient that we can be in the field. You might be surprised to hear this, but one of the top requests that we had from your community members was want for more parking enforcement. And I know that that might be surprising because nobody wants to get a parking ticket, but I think what you'll see is that your community has a want for consistent coverage and the fact that they want to be sure that the rules are being enforced as stated. And so I think that that's important when we talk about the LPR technology, is we have the ability to be more efficient because our license plates currently would become our permits. So as the vehicles drive up and down the streets, the system is basically saying that car is eligible, that car is not eligible. Versus when we went out with your graveyard shift, they literally have to get out and look at the dashboards, as well as validate the validity of the decals as well. So these are real efficiencies that do come along with the program. I want to highlight, sometimes you'll hear folks talk about automated enforcement and things like that. We're not there yet in California. In fact, the only time that you can mail a parking citation in California is a vehicle is parked in a bus lane, a vehicle that's parked on a bike lane, or a person that drives away during the act of a parking citation being issued. So I think that's important to note, is that there's still a human element in our enforcement coverage, and our opportunity to leverage LPR technology allows us to cover more ground. And I think that that's something that your community is definitely looking for and something that will be very well received. Now, mind you, if parking tickets start to get issued, the phone may still ring, but ideally there's a learning curve for maybe folks that have gotten accustomed to maybe not having that consistent enforcement. And the reality is, whatever we do, this always comes with education and outreach. I always like to share, there should never be a surprise when we're talking about parking, ever. You want people to know what the rules are because you want to make it easy for people to follow the rules. And so whatever we can do to educate and outreach and make sure people know what's coming, especially if it was a relaunch of the program or if we were launching the LPR technology, we want people to understand what that is. There's one more thing, since I'm talking about LPR, that I always like to cover this. Sometimes people hear about LPR and they go, Big Brother, oh my gosh, they're going to know that that's Julie Dixon's car and all of those factors. And I just want to describe the simplest way that LPR works, is that the LPR is designed literally to tell the enforcement officer as they're driving down the street, that plate is good to park there, or that plate is not good to park there. I don't know that that's Julie's car. I don't know that that's Zed's car. I don't know the difference between any of those details. What the system is basically saying as we're driving through, green means good, red means bad. Stop and interrogate and see what's going on with this car. And, maybe it has a disabled placard or some other factor that causes me to dig into it a little bit differently. But I like to highlight that those programs that have proven to utilize LPR have shown to be much more efficient, because you also don't have to hire as many personnel, because you're not having to get out of the car as frequently, and your ability to be much more efficient, especially on a rainy day like today. I got to tell you, LPR is a real game changer. So let's talk for a moment about the methodology. This is something that's really important when we talk about data and we talk about how to move this forward. As I mentioned, the inclusion of the multifamily complexes is really important as we talk about this process moving forward. And it's really important when we talk about the equitability factor. That's really important. And if there's one thing that I hope you all walk away from here today, is that we are talking about limited inventory. When we talk about on-street parking spaces, there are only so many parking spaces that we're dealing with here. And the fact is, there's high demand for those locations. And so that's going to be really important when we talk about being able to address the parking needs at a district level, as well as in micro areas as well. Because this is part of the thing that if you ask me to look in my crystal ball based on what's happening in California at the legislative level, I would anticipate that within 5 to 7 years, we won't even have residential parking permit programs, except but in maybe 3 instances where you're adjacent to a neighboring city and you have spillover, you're adjacent to a commercial district and you have spillover during business hours, or you're adjacent to a venue like a high school or like a concert venue or like a fairground. And now this is just based on my experience, especially here in California. It doesn't change anything that we're doing here today because none of the rules have changed. But based on the way the legislation is heading, I think it's important that we're cognizant of that because again, as we're trying to move towards transit-oriented development and they're looking for our footprint of vehicles to change, we are going to have to start to open up our streets. And I think that that's going to be an important factor when we talk about parking utilization methodologies. It's why data is going to be so important as we drive this conversation forward, because we have to be sure that folks recognize is that we can't address the need that's out there. If any of you have spent time in some of your neighborhood streets, we've even introduced parking stackers in some of the multifamily complexes too, where, you know, the folks pull in and they've got the little car elevator. And I don't know if you're aware of that. We actually have several of those installed throughout the city on private property locations. That's how significant the demand has become. And again, we see more legislation coming down the block when it relates to the housing crisis. And again, we're just looking at providing more housing. And even though we're hopeful they don't have cars, again, being a realist, they do. So this is going to be important when we talk about the process moving forward. We want to be sure that we recognize again that you will not be able to submit a request moving forward if it excludes multifamily. And you can see even in this workflow that if you exclude multifamily, basically circle back to the beginning because you can't exclude multifamily from that process. And as we basically move through this workflow, it's going to be important to recognize that we have to understand what parking assets are available. And this is going to be important to even get to the petitioning process in this flow as we talk through how this is going to work moving forward. Now, this is where it does get a little bit complicated, but it's something that as we talk about this process, it's the importance of if you make it to the petitioning process, basically what the qualified home is versus the net need. Now, this is where we can't fabricate parking spaces that don't exist. And this is going to be really important where we're basically going to have to limit the number of parking permits that you're allowed for per household. And so what's going to happen is as the program opens up and allows others to participate in, it means you're really going to start to have to narrow the gap of how many permits folks are eligible for. And it's why, as we talk about this program moving forward, why shared parking agreements are going to be a very important part of the future of this program. So shared parking agreements are something that are really prevalent throughout the United States because building new parking assets is very expensive. And I also want to highlight they cost a lot of money. And the reality is, where are you going to put them as well? It's not like we can have a floating parking garage over a neighborhood or anything like that. And even shuttling systems and factors that we've talked about before, using the example when I started, one of the things that, you know, I've identified in previous projects is you've got the Santa Ana Zoo parking lot that's right there adjacent to some very dense housing locations. Our ability to potentially multi-purpose that parking lot as a shared parking agreement. What's happened over the years is that the technology has evolved in such a way that we can try to leverage parking assets like that. Especially with the technology, because I now have your information so that if I need to communicate to you, like you're in violation of a parking policy or you've overstayed the rule at a shared parking location, you get like one strike. And then after that, you lose your parking permit privileges. And I think that one of the benefits that we have is that because parking is so restrictive and so limited in Santa Ana, that you can imagine folks would not want to lose that privilege of being able to park in like a shared parking location. So the technology has really evolved and we're very optimistic that our ability to leverage shared parking agreements will become a big factor because I'm sure you can all appreciate we can't invent what does not exist. And the reality is there are only so many parking spaces on a block face. And again, the more folks that live here, the bigger challenge it is when it comes to where they park their cars. So I know that was a lot, but let's just talk about next steps. Hearing your feedback here today is really important to us as well, so that we can also report out to council and make any updates to the approaches that we've described here today. And then we want to continue our data collection. We actually started in September and are right at the tail end of our current round of data collection. This is really important to continue with the trend analysis, to be able to really identify what is happening by block face. And we literally have that micro detail to be able to drill in to understand what those implications and impacts are. as well as how long cars are dwelling for, and also the frequency at which they're parking. There's a lot of robust data that comes out of the parking analytics. And then in terms of next steps is procuring that parking management system that will allow us to take the permit system online is a big part of that. And then in hopes of, again, depending on today and what happens with council, is basically heading towards the 2026 rollout of the new residential parking permit program with a very large education campaign and community engagement as a result of that. And so with that, we have a project email address that has been ongoing since the project started. And I just really want to recognize, like I said, you've got a very engaged community and a city staff that is very involved and responsive. It's actually been very refreshing. Just the amount of community care that exists here is something that we don't necessarily see everywhere that we go. And I really appreciate that. Many of our staff members also live in the city. So I definitely can feel that kind of hometown pride. And that really does make a difference in how realistic this project and this model is. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Zed. At this time, does anyone have any questions?
I think everybody has questions.
We do.
Where do you want to, let's start at that end and work our way this way.
I know you came in late.
So probably.
Okay, we'll come back to you.
It was a
We'll
lot.
come back to you. Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Really appreciate you taking the time to come out and speak with us today. So let me start with, I wanted to go back to, you talked about changing the petition process for the new parking permit program. I wanted to talk about how you were talking about having both owners and tenants be able to vote on this. Now, I wanted to clarify because the way that it was phrased kind of made it sound that like rental units might get 2 votes in a way. So I wanted to clarify, is each residence on a street only getting 1 vote? And for rental units, who is deciding whether the tenant or the owner is the voting member?
That's a great question. And ultimately, this comes down to city policy. What we're suggesting is that you need to be sure that this is addressed in the business rules of the program. And ultimately, in some communities, they have decided property owner does have veto rights on the tenant vote. But in some cases, you have one property owner, maybe for 100 units, for example. That property owner technically does get 1 vote. The city can weight that vote. But ultimately, we're simply suggesting that you need to ensure that you don't overlook the tenants and the determination of what you want that weight of the vote to be and whether they're equal in caliber or if one overrides the other. There are some communities where tenants do not have a voice in that, where simply the recommendation is to be sure that you have that consideration and ultimately what the city decides, whether again, it be an overriding vote or 1 vote compared to the 100. Those are all factors that can get into the business rule details. We just want to make sure that you don't overlook the tenants in that process.
Does any of the city staff have any insight into what direction that's going?
Good afternoon, thank you. Rudy Rosas, Acting Public Works Director. It would be the tenant gets a vote and the owner can override the vote. So 1 vote per property or dwelling unit.
Okay, thank you. All right, moving on to my next set of questions. So I wanted to discuss further about the parking enforcement and how that would look like with the license plate readers. So as the program currently stands, we have the stickers, we have the paper passes, and residents themselves are able to kind of by sight visualize like, oh, that car has a permit. Oh, they have a guest pass. Oh, they don't. Let me call parking enforcement. And then I can have parking enforcement come out to my neighborhood. Because as it stands, we don't have enough staff to patrol all of the neighborhoods that have permits.
Right.
And as you said in your presentation, the number 1 want from residents is more enforcement.
Right.
So my concern here is that without the ability to look into our neighborhoods ourselves and say that, oh, there is an enforcement problem, then we're just relying on whether enforcement is coming around and catching people. And, that's a pretty big issue, I think, insofar as like, how are we going to staff that? Are we going to need to, how much more staff investment are we going to need? and it's already going to be a cost to, you know, get this equipment, the license plate technology. So what kind of upfront cost are we looking at? Is this going to raise the cost of the permits to fund this program more? What are the foreseen costs
Sure.
for this?
Lots of good questions. And I will tell you, visual indicators are usually one of the most common requests that we have in communities to say, like, we like to see that permit because I like to know who belongs in my neighborhood, right? So the reality is that the city has the responsibility to ensure that you have the consistent coverage on your street so that you should not need those visual indicators, because if we're doing our jobs sufficiently and consistently, we're out there enforcing the rules, and the cars that don't belong are being cited and or eventually towed if they're scofflaws. So I think that that's one of the things that we as an agency have to earn the trust of the neighborhood, and that's got to be demonstrated through the relaunch of this program and the demonstration of those resources. So I'll use the city of Costa Mesa as an example. Before Costa Mesa relaunched their program, they had 3 part-time parking enforcement officers to basically cover the citywide program, not too far off from where your program is today. 3 years into this relaunch of their program, they currently have 14 parking enforcement officers today, and they are cooking, is the easiest way I can describe it. The complaints are not coming in, the calls for service are not coming in, because they have adequately and consistently covered the city streets. Now, nothing is perfect. There's no parking program that would ever will be. But I appreciate the visual indicator that you're asking for, because again, having heard that request from many communities, I appreciate that. But the reality is you all shouldn't need to be the ones enforcing the policies of your own streets. And if we're doing our jobs the way that we're supposed to be, that shouldn't be a demand on you. And you're only calling in a suspicious car or something that, you know, has drawn your eye for whatever particular reason. So it is going to take some staffing resources. And the one other thing that we have is the ability with the technology, we will be able to identify the coverage that we also will have, because we'll have what we call breadcrumbing, where we'll actually be able to identify, so that when you call and say, I've never seen a parking enforcement officer on my street. If this happened in Pasadena and they made a phone call and said, I haven't seen a parking enforcement officer on my street, we'll say, well, it must have been when you weren't home then, because I can tell you there was a parking enforcement officer on your street 3 times yesterday at this time, and this time. So that's one of the advantages when we talk about the technology of how we are being able to manage differently. And we were even talking yesterday about like heat maps and the ways that we can start to manage this in a different way. Now, one thing that's also important, and I shared this yesterday too, was we didn't get to where we are overnight. We are not going to fix this overnight. And I think that that's really important. Just like I said at the beginning, parking will always be part of the conversation in Santa Ana, because just again, the density challenges we have, the number of cars, etc. But the reality is the phone should stop ringing about enforcement. The phone should stop ringing about my ability to find available parking, because if we're out there consistently enforcing the rules, ideally there's always going to be spaces available on that block base. So when you talk about, I call it parking utopia, right? I know we're very far off from that, but if we're doing our jobs consistently the way that it's designed to do, you won't have some of the concern or the headache maybe that we heard from a lot of the community members moving forward as we start to talk about how to roll out this program. And this is not with a heavy enforcement hand. It doesn't mean that you have to come out there and drop the hammer and start papering the city and parking citations by any means. It just means that everyone needs to understand that there is a good chance that if I break the rules, I'm going to get caught. And that's ultimately what parking enforcement is supposed to be in any city, is that I need to influence your behavior to do things the way you're supposed to do for the risk of you getting a parking citation. And that's ultimately how an ideal municipal program is designed. How many bodies that is, we've definitely done financial modeling ultimately, but this will be a work in progress as well, especially as you talk about kind of the evolution of expanding permit zones, you know, and basically even shared parking zones, like how those will be managed in the future.
So I'd like to provide a little more detail for you on that specific question, Commissioner Cheney. We have met with our police department and collaborated on what is appropriate enforcement level. What do they recommend for, you know, city our size, all this. And They did share with us sort of two ranges, right? One is the eye-opening, oh my gosh, how can we afford it? But it would give you 24/7 coverage and enforcement on the spot. As Julie was commenting, this is going to be approached incrementally. And so we do have a starting point that they, being police department, did recommend, where we would contract with the LAS parking enforcement officers to the tune of 3 or 4 parking enforcement officers and a supervisor that would be out there, again, set times, right? So we would probably do early morning, late night. This is when we're more likely to be effective for parking enforcement. But yes, there is a cost to that. It's in the range of $750,000 annually. And this does have an impact to ultimately what the parking permit fee is, right? So there's a balance in all this. We want our permit parking program to be more effective and address the needs. As we were describing, I think the two big elements is from the community input is, the parking program is terrible because I don't want to wait in line. So there's a technology component and how we can do better in terms of issuing and having our program be more administratively efficient. The second piece is enforcement. That's great. We can issue permits, but without the enforcement, it won't be successful. Both of those have a cost that needs to be borne by someone. And the message I'm trying to keep in people's forefront is this is a voluntary program. Nobody's forcing you to have permit parking. This is to the benefit of the residents that want it. And so therefore, there's a cost to go with that. But this is all part of what we're meant to do. We just can't go back to business as usual. So these are sort of the recommendations we'll be making.
Yes, thank you both. And I think, Julie, you raised I appreciate your viewpoint sharing with us, the trust from the community and especially from neighboring municipalities. And I think that is an important thing. And I'm glad that you guys have been doing all of the outreach that you have and involving the community in this process. I had one final question for you. In the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about the 85% threshold for parking in neighborhoods. I wanted to talk to you about exactly how that 85% is calculated. Is that based off of, if you're using the license plate reading technology, are you calculating cars per block, or are you taking into account the size of vehicles and the curb space that is actually being taken up?
Great question. You got to come to one of our staff meetings. So ultimately what we do is there's 2 ways to go about it. If they're marked stalls, obviously very easy to delineate the inventory by block face, but the majority of your block faces are not marked. And so what we end up doing is we actually take the curb measure. And so what we've done is we've standardized. So a typical parking space is between 22 and 24 feet wide in general. But in a residential neighborhood, especially in many of your residential neighborhoods where we've kind of compacted our cars, what we've actually done is we've taken a measure of 20 feet for a typical parking space and actually 18 feet if it's adjacent to a driveway. So we're actually being very generous that if we actually applied the 22 and 24 foot measures, you can imagine your occupancy numbers would actually show higher. But we wanted to be able to demonstrate. Now, I know a lot of residents won't love this because people are parking buttressed up against their driveways and it's very difficult to obviously get in and get out. But from an inventory perspective, what we're actually doing is the LPR is actually counting the cars, but we're also utilizing the space distance to determine what the proper inventory could be. Now, you highlighted something that's really important, which is the oversized vehicles. And that is something that when you look at our statute, that is something too that we can more proactively also enforce, which is something that is, on the list of community feedback that we also received, is that that's something too, that if we could drive those vehicles out of our residential neighborhoods, no pun intended, there's a real opportunity to, again, free up more space for what is a typical passenger vehicle as well. But it's a combination of 2 things, but ultimately it's a space measure to determine that inventory by block face. And then the LPR basically counts the number of plates per block face. And then we're able to aggregate from there in terms of what the occupancy is as well.
Okay, so during these initial phases of data gathering, then you are just counting units of cars per allotted space on the street.
Basically, that's the simplest way to describe it, yes.
Yes. And so yeah, some neighborhoods obviously are disproportionately affected by the oversized vehicles parking on residential
Absolutely.
neighborhoods. So that's not being accounted for in the initial data collection, but we are considering that so far as changing municipal code in the future.
Exactly. And in fact, there's one other element, and this is potentially in the future, is being able to leverage. In some agencies, we actually utilize drone data collection for occupancy specifically to address exactly what you're describing, because you know how they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So that is something too, in terms of potential for future utilization on data analysis. That wasn't necessarily available to us when we first started doing data collection. Drones have come a long way.
Yeah.
So the opportunity for us to leverage drone usage is something that's on I'll say it's on the shopping list for options as well. That can really be a game changer, especially in those neighborhoods that are particularly impacted by oversized vehicles, for that main purpose as well. It also helps when we're taking policies forward for the folks that don't necessarily live that every day. When they can see the images of that, it's very impactful.
Yeah, and that's actually, yeah, a very interesting concept, like taking drone footage of streets. And then I'm sure you'd actually be able to calculate much better the percentage of curb usage that's really being used rather than the license plate.
We're actually using it as an audit tool when we really start to talk about that ability to just add that extra layer of accuracy. You'd be really pleasantly surprised at how accurate the LPR technology is, but the drone has just added that kind of cherry on top. And that's something that we've been chatting with the city about, the utilization of that potentially in the future.
Okay, excellent. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. That's all I have.
Thank you.
Commissioner Alvarado, ton of questions, ton of comments. I know you're collecting data as well with this meeting. One of the very first thing is the LPR. That, like you mentioned, that is a very big political issue in the city of Santa Ana with our elected leaders there now. And so, you know, the biggest thing is using LPR for anything but the enforcement of this. Now, the police department or the city council will figure that out. I'm hoping that your recommendation to our city council is it will only be used for this.
Correct.
That no other data is going to be presented on a computer screen for the parking enforcement, because we've seen that already. And if you don't know, like the downtown Santa Ana where Laz is the parking enforcement, they were giving tickets for the parking meters, but then tinted windows,
Right.
all that thing. And so that already came to the city council a couple months ago. They put a direction to stop doing that. And so I would tell you, just as a comment or as your notes, that's something that if you present it any other way in the city council, it won't go through.
And I can assure you, based on Senate Bill 36, if the numbers become blended, there are very strict rules in regards to how we are allowed to utilize LPR data. And I can tell you that when we launched the use of LPR for data collection, Public Works went and worked extensively with city attorney's office to make sure that we were very much, I'm going to use the term, handcuffed by what we could use the data for. And I think it's very important when I describe the safeguards for how we use the data. I can also further to you to make you hopefully sleep a little bit better at night. All of our LPR data for the data is anonymized. And I think that that's really important to recognize, so that when I literally tell you like the thumbs up, thumbs down, the plate information is even anonymized in all of our analysis as well. So there's literally no connection to the plate on my car to ultimately how we even aggregate the data.
Okay. Another comment as well regarding that is we have a lot of neighborhoods where the density is a lot more than in other areas. And usually that's a lower income. And so for registration, if I'm going to register my vehicle, and this happened to me when I was a teenager, where I didn't have money to pay for my registration and I was saving. So I was driving a couple months without a valid. Now, if I lived in an area where I had to pay for a parking permit, right? So now I have to figure out what's more important now, and would I be able to register my car if my license plate is unregistered or is expired? Because again, I'm saving money to pay for my registration, but at the same time, all of a sudden I need to register my car. I get a parking ticket for $100.
Yep.
And now I can't.
It just furthers the cycle.
Right.
So because I work in the parking industry, this is a very sensitive subject in regards to how you tackle this, because again, we all have to make life decisions. I think it's also important, number one, to recognize the business rules by which our residential parking enforcement officers enforce is something that's established by the city and or the police department, right? So if they're gonna write expired registration tickets, that becomes a policy related issue, and again, up to the police department. But one of the things I want to highlight is a typical business rule for a residential parking permit program is that your registration does have to be valid in order to obtain a parking permit. But what I want to share is that many programs in California have what I call indigency, I can never say it, indigency options, so that the reality of your ability to pay for your registration first and through proof of that type of payment, there's opportunities to be able to potentially have a payment plan associated with your parking permit, opportunities that allow you to take the different options so that we can enable you to follow the rules and not further punish you. So I think what's important is in a community, especially like Santa Ana, is that we need to bring programs and opportunities like that forward so that we can ensure, again, the survival of our community and making sure that folks can live and work and, do what they have to do. I know many a community member that, like I have to negotiate with my parents so that I park on the driveway so that when I get home from work at 2 a.m., there's a space and, they park on the street for that matter. So there is some of that kind of juggling that does occur in reality. But I do think that the opportunities to appeal those opportunities to city staff and to make sure that we have options for those types of scenarios. We've had to work that out with citation penalty payments in the state of California so that, again, we don't prohibit you from going to work because you don't have a car to go to work with. So I do think that there's several options that are available, and it's something that we can easily build into the implementation of a program.
And the reason I mention it is everybody in this room can picture our leadership at city council now. And if there isn't anything like that, they're gonna chop this thing, up.
Yep.
So I wanted, make sure that it's out there as well. The area like we have here in Washington Square, I believe that area is parking permit only. The density in that area is not the same as the density, when you cross Flower. So if how do I put this? If I'm somebody that has a lot of time and effort in my neighborhood, then I'm going to petition for this, right? And so does actual density come into play when asking for a street or an area to be, right? Because like I said, I see myself, hey, Washington Square has parking permits now. Across the street on Willard, there isn't, right? But the one that should have the parking permits is Willard and not really Washington Square.
So I hate to say it's not an easy answer, but it's not an easy answer because when you talk about, let's just talk about the multifamily. The first thing to determine that building, to make sure that they're eligible to participate, or this block face is eligible to participate, we need to look at how their parking is being managed. And this is going to be important. This kind of goes back to the question you had about the property owner, right? And if anyone hasn't dealt with multifamily situations, we call it bundled versus unbundled parking, right? So one of the things we have to first look at too is how are the off-street parking spaces being managed today and if they're being utilized. This would be a contributing factor into the eligibility opportunities. And we talked about the qualified home versus the net need and looking at the number of parking spaces that are eligible. But I will share with you, neighboring communities from you all, neighboring cities, have broken down the walls, I'll call it that, or broken down the rules so that contiguous block faces can apply into existing neighborhoods. Now, in some cases, arterials, main roads can be, segregating, those areas, but those are going to be some of the details when we start to talk about the rules that go into it. And trying to make it easy for you as a resident to understand, like, how do I apply to get into that process? And that's part of really what comes next, creating that formula so that you can understand, is my block face first and foremost eligible? And the realities of determining those properties, if they're managing their parking, how they're managing their parking, and do they check all the boxes to then be able to apply into creating a rule or again, appealing into another process. So it's the formula is is quite, I hate to say complicated, but did city staff have anything else you wanted to add about the net need versus the qualified homes? I know this is a heavy one.
That's funny. That's the area I've been relying on you all.
Yeah, it's, so I will say this, the opportunity to petition in is there, but there are several qualifiers that have to go into it. So there would basically be a menu kind of going through that workflow that we had up there before. You basically have to go through the criteria, check the boxes to be able to open the door. And I think that's probably, so the opportunity, there's potential, but there's factors. And so I'd say that there's potential in, and the reality of distinguishing between multifamily and single family is probably the clearest part of this, is that we can't differentiate between the two, but you also have to make sure that you're managing your parking assets as they stand. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay.
Will there be areas in Santa Ana where you will recommend the permit process to start without applicants in that neighborhood?
It's a great question. I get asked that a lot, and honestly, no, because you need your residents to want a residential parking permit program, because this becomes a quality of life factor that also inhibits your life. You're gonna have certain rules you have to follow, your guest passes, all of those factors.
Understood.
You're gonna pay.
I would recommend or ask that part of the comments that you're taking today is that you look at the higher density areas in Santa Ana, because those are the ones that are the least active in the community.
Right.
Right. And so those are going to be the ones that are affected the most by this. And so those are the ones that have the least, voice out there.
Sure.
And so if we don't have something default for them, they're going to be stuck in a corner as well.
I think that's why the shared parking agreements are so important. Because the opportunity to introduce more parking opportunities where they're available is something that I think is a low-hanging fruit opportunity for the city. You don't have to have a residential parking permit program per se to be able to introduce a shared parking agreement. The reality is you're providing more parking assets. There's a cost for that parking space to be able to park there, but it basically provides more parking opportunities, and they can be private shared agreements, public shared agreements, all sorts of forms. But I do think that when you start to talk about the challenges that you've described, and I definitely understand them, in some cases, there's nothing wrong with the city direct messaging and being able to help make sure that a community is aware of their options. You just have to make sure that the community wants those options. And I only say that because it can prove restrictive. If I want to have a Super Bowl party, or, again, I want to have family or friends
Right.
over for dinner. Anybody that lives in a residential parking permit neighborhood knows that you have limitations put on you.
And I would ask for you to speak to the city staff. Like an example is, we have an agreement for large trash bins
Yep.
in the city. Why wouldn't entire neighborhoods do that on a quarterly basis? And if you ask our executive director, I think we're still, we haven't maxed out. We're not even close to maxing out, right? And the communities that have used it are the ones that not necessarily are the ones in need of that,
Yeah,
right?
that's fair.
And so that's something that would spill into this. Regarding the shared spaces, it's a great recommendation. We've seen it in other areas. I've spoken to the CDA director about that. I would recommend that you go out and actually speak to the businesses and the school district.
Yep.
Because if you recommend it, everybody's going to say yes, but how feasible is it?
Yep.
Right. And so that's something that I think the city council will need to know how feasible it is, and who's willing to play ball and who's not. And then again, there might be some incentives that you need to work with permits or planning to do that as well.
Yep, or private party agreements where you end up purchasing your permit from the church or, from the school per se. I will just say, in the communities that shared parking agreements have worked, it's been where the city has played the role of broker in that regard, and in ultimately also municipal enforcement. In some of these cases, private property or even school district property that becomes municipally enforced, I think is really
Right.
key. So there's definitely.
And I'll give you
Yeah.
another example of that. If you were to ask the city would the city be able to would be willing to open City Hall and the parking at City Hall? I think city council would say, probably yes, we would. Some city staff, I'm not talking about public works,
Sure.
but they would say, absolutely not. There's a security risk, except same thing that our private owners are gonna say.
Sure.
And I think that would be a great example to present to the city and say, hey, the first one we're gonna open is gonna be City Hall
It's
and
a-
its areas.
It's a very realistic request and the whole kind of put up or shut up, right? You
Right.
gotta demonstrate. that you
City-owned
can do
property,
it. Yeah,
correct.
Absolutely.
And then the last thing, I don't know if it was last meeting or 2 meetings ago, we had a group that was working and studying on zoning. And I asked them if they have been working with your team and the parking. They said no. So I won't ask you, but I would recommend that you speak to them on that
Definitely.
study that's going on now.
For
So
sure.
that in 10 years, we don't have this problem.
No, absolutely. And I will, that's why I wanted to kind of bring some of the legislative things, which it sounds like you probably heard all about
Mhm.
already, is the reality. I always like to say parking touches everything. And that's something that's why I kind of become a bit of an evangelist when it comes to these policies. And it's why I like to bring the legislative issues forward, because you all are living it as well. So you can appreciate that. So,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Hi, thank you for your presentation,
Thank you.
Julie. This is Larry Klein. If we go with an online tool to register and pay for parking, shouldn't the cost to the resident be a bit less because you're not involving the city staff per se?
I will say this, your permits are about the average price within the region. We need to do some further financial modeling based on the approvals and of the process, so that we can go out and ideally in the implementation process, define what the rate should be. I'm going to anticipate that your rate probably won't change too dramatically, having done a similar project in another community. And your rate model came out to be just about the same amount. You have to keep in mind the fact that we do have to purchase the permit management system. And while it's not onerous, it's probably about $15,000 off the shelf, licensing and other factors like that too, credit card charges, all that kind of stuff. So I would say this, some additional modeling needs to be done. If the pricing changed, it wouldn't be dramatic of a change. So either up or down for that matter is what I would anticipate. But from all the modeling that we have, I would anticipate that your price is pretty close, but it would be half because you would be paying
Right.
annually.
Yeah. I would think, though, that for a tool that you buy, it's a one-time cost.
Annual licensing too. And then don't forget, we gotta pay for those enforcement officers too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got a friend and she lives on a street that another street tees into. The street that tees into her street has residential parking. Her street does not. Yet, when she has an event at her house, she has guests. Parking spots now on her street have been taken up by cars that parked on the T Street.
Sure,
Her friends can't park on the T Street.
right,
Yet she's not eligible
right.
to get guest parking permits because her block
Isn't eligible.
Can you do something
So
about
that would be one of the opportunities of a block face like that, being able to appeal into a zone that it pre-exists. So when we talk about contiguous block faces, it kind of goes into what Mario was asking as well. It depends, like this is where the issue of qualified homes and, the net parking issue comes into play, where those homes would have to be evaluated. But the opportunity for a contiguous block to appeal into an existing zone is an opportunity. So I would say that would be one of the ones as a result of this new program, that a block face like where she lives, the first thing I would do is I would look at the rules and say, can I appeal to be a part of that program? And then she would likely, based on that workflow, appeal to all of her neighbors and go get the petition, fill out the first form and then get all of her neighbors to sign a petition to ultimately try to join into a neighboring zone or potentially become their own zone as well. So potentially, yes.
But she'd still need the same percent of people on her block, she couldn't do it as a,
Not individually.
Individually.
That's one, so that's one thing I think when we talk about permits. We try to talk about zone-based parking permit management rather than individual blocks and individual homes, definitely no, because then that's a whole nother issue. But even down to the block face, it can prove to be onerous because you really start to even mitigate the issues even more. It's even more impactful. So one of our general rules of thumb is contiguous blocks. You want to be sure that also from an enforcement perspective, you want to be able to understand what the rules are. And you don't want people constantly scratching their head trying to figure out, well, can I park here or can I not park here? Remember, it goes back to parking being easy, convenient, and accessible. It means that I need to be able to pull onto a block and know, can I park here or can't I park here? You've got to be sure without having sign blight, a sign every 10 feet. So it really is about striking that balance. And ideally, you would drive into a neighborhood and know what the rules are. Kind of like when you drive into a city and you see the no overnight parking restriction or the no oversized vehicle restriction. Ideally, we have that type of an opportunity driving into a neighborhood so that you as a visitor or as a resident understand what the rules are when you park. Because again, transparency in parking, we want you to follow the rules. We want you to know what the rules are.
yeah. So her side of the street, one long block, I mean long,
Mm-hmm,
eighth of a mile,
mm-hmm,
easily.
mm-hmm.
How do you get all those people to sign?
So this definitely is not easy. So, I mean, when we talk about neighborhood campaigns, I've seen people set up like lemonade style tables. I've seen people go out with their wagons door to door. Another very common resource is applications like Nextdoor, because this is how you get the word out. As long as you can deal with the trolls, mind you, if anything
Yeah.
goes on Nextdoor, right? But I do think that there's several messaging opportunities. And when we design ultimately the implementation plan, we want to be able to have what I'll call a community packet. So that for your friend, like they're like, how do I go about this? To have an information packet, kind of like an FAQ or a how-to guide to make it easy for your friend to be able to navigate this process. That's really ultimately the goal. I have to say, in an ideal world, we wouldn't need to have residential parking permits overall. But again, it's where we are today. But we want to make it easy for people to figure it out because it's about quality of life, right? We want to make sure that we can come home after dinner and know that I can find a parking space.
Thank you. One of the issues I've had in my neighborhood, when I first moved in, my streets were open to everybody, and I didn't care. Till the people that parked there started to dump their trash at the curb, and I found other things near the curbs too.
Yep.
How do you deal with that problem, opening up neighborhoods? to
It
people that
is,
don't-
it is a challenge. I don't want to tell you that I have an answer for that. I mean, the reality of this comes down to just being good people, being good neighbors ultimately. And I mean, I'm sad to tell you that that is a problem that we face just across the country. And, community care is a big part of it. And I do think that you do have an engaged community where, the more activated our curbs are, the more people that are out there walking with their families, walking their dogs. It's that visibility factor too. But today, being able to walk on some of your block faces that are covered with oversized vehicles and stuff like that, those are the kind of things we talk about really opening up your lines of sight that I think would have an impact overall. But I mean, it's kind of a societal issue. I hate to pass the buck on that, but I do think that the more visibility that we have in our neighborhoods, and we talk about these programs kind of like earning back the community trust, I think these are all factors that can contribute to improved situations for what you're describing. I can't guarantee you or promise you anything that, that we can fix it, but my hope would be that we would be able to just again kind of reactivate our sidewalks in hopes that that would bring a level of improvement.
Thank you. One last
Sure.
question. I've seen large commercial vehicles parked in single-family driveways, and I believe that's against code.
Mhm.
Would the parking officers be allowed to cite those vehicles?
So I don't want to, I will defer to city staff on this only because in most cases, our parking enforcement officers are only authorized to enforce the municipal code and the vehicle code. I'm seeing a head nod. And typically what would happen is those would be code enforcement complaints that you would basically submit to the city. And then code enforcement would respond to those types of issues. It is something that ideally our parking enforcement officers are trained to proactively identify kind of those urban blight concerns so that they can also call them in for that matter as well. So I think that one of the things that's advantageous when we talk about our parking enforcement personnel is they are another pair of eyes and ears in our neighborhood. So I think the ability to proactively be able to identify things like that is ideally the goal. Hopefully we get to a place where we're cruising with that LPR and proactively identifying, things that need to be fixed or street lights that are out. And that's the ideal design when we talk about kind of this parking ambassador role, to be out there and really provide that, extra visibility factor, which I think would really be a big service for the city of Santa Ana. Yes, on code enforcement for the other things.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Commissioner Reyes.
Commissioner Baeza, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to underscore what Commissioner Alvarado had mentioned about the use of the LPR technology and request to have no other data shared other than like the licensing. And I also wanted to ask if that information is stored.
That's it. So that's actually part of the requirements for the Senate Bill 36 on how long the data can be retained for. I have to go back and check the policy. Forgive me, I don't have it memorized, but I do believe that the data is not stored for longer than 7 days. It's a limited time for where it's retained for, but the data is ultimately dumped and the information that's used for the data analysis, like I mentioned, is anonymized. So there's no original plate retention.
Okay, thank you. And then if there will be a higher frequency of code enforcement because of the use of the LPR, I don't know if you are able to give like a recommendation. Will the citation costs be lowered in case they are given out more frequently?
So great question. So ideally, I want to make sure I'll say parking enforcement because code enforcement's kind of going to deal with the issue that the other commission member was mentioning. So what we were describing earlier was the ability for the police department to bring in the contractor. So that's where you can see this incremental opportunity to start to increase coverage, to start to cover the issues. And you would not bring the citation penalties down, but ideally with the relaunch of the program, we would have a warning campaign that would tie into kind of this, what I'll call relaunch of the program. And so that ideally in a warning campaign, you give a swath of notices, of warning notices out, which don't have a penalty attached to that. But one of the things that you also do is you have a business rule of how many warning notices are issued before a citation is issued. Because what a lot of people will be, oh, it's the 30-day warning period. This is my get out of jail free card the entire month. What a lot of agencies will do is they'll be like 2 warning notices and then you're getting a citation because that's the whole purpose of a warning notice. So some of that will come down to business rules. But one of the things that I also could describe, and this is something that's newer in California, but it's working very well. I don't know that you're old enough to remember this, but when the seatbelt law got introduced in California, many of us can remember the very first ticket, the very first time you got pulled over was a warning. Second time it was 25, then it was 50, then it was 75, and then it was $100, right? Because it was intended to teach us to buckle our seatbelts. And I know you guys all are like, what do you mean? We didn't use to buckle our seatbelts? What? That was a thing. So One of the things that some agencies in California have been proceeding with is what I will call an incremental penalty schedule. So I do think that this is something that we could absolutely consider in Santa Ana as an opportunity, and being sure to tie that into our recommendations, to be able to leverage that, because that's one of the ways to, again, teach folks to, again, like buckle your seatbelt, right? It was a way that we found has been very effective in other communities to bring what we call a tiered penalty schedule forward. And so that's something that, seeing your heads nod, we can definitely incorporate that as one of the recommendations as well, for consideration too. But I think that that probably gets closer to what you're aiming for. And I also think that with the other commissioner, I think that the one thing I want to make sure that everyone understands when we talk about parking is, again, ideally, if we didn't have to write a parking ticket, that's a win, right? But the reality is we need folks to understand, you know, that what the rules are. We want you to follow the rules. And it does mean ultimately tickets do get issued. But the goal is never to write a car multiple citations. And it's typically what we call a scofflaw, which is the folks that are just ignoring the rules and just, it doesn't matter what you do. And those are the folks that you don't really want parking on your block anyways, because usually there's other things going on too. So, but I really appreciate your thought about that, and we'll definitely incorporate that tiered rate model as an option.
Thank you. I appreciate you discussing the whole seatbelt example. And then I think you mentioned possibly having a payment plan option when you get the permit. So if that could also be included, I think it would be a good idea. And then my last comment is for the shared agreement parking opportunity, the use of the zoo parking lot. I don't know if you're able to give the recommendation to or encourage there to be a bus stop there, like a drop off.
Great point.
Because one of the concerns during the workshops I attended was that there's lack of connectivity
Yep.
in our public transportation system. So if you're
sure.
able to give that recommendation, I think that'd be very helpful.
We will, and I think this also speaks to the commissioner next to you, is when it comes to the rates as well. Some communities have gotten very creative in some of their solutioning so that if a dedicated bus route isn't viable, sometimes they're not. We've also been able to work through what we call guaranteed ride home programs, where you actually can park in a remote location and call like an Uber and get an Uber voucher. So there's programs like that that other communities are launching, which again, all of these things have a cost. I don't want to be shy about that. But the reality of our ability to build a very, I will call it customer-centric solution. So as we were talking about yesterday, I always like to describe parking as a customer service extension of the city, right? And the fact that we want it to be easy for folks. So I think that the more that we get into the implementation part of the process, the more flexibility that we want to bring to our residents. And I think that that's the part that there's so many rules and so many reasons to be able to cover with all of you today, that when we come back with the implementation plan, that's when it really gets fun, because that's when we can talk about where, you know, all the bells and whistles kind of come in and all the different opportunities that we can offer as, you know, options to be able to hopefully be covered with the program as well.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
What's that? Commissioner Reynos, you have any?
Thank you for the presentation and all your explanations. So in the new parking requests for the multiple family complexes, can you explain, sorry, what is in the analysis, what is the criteria that you're looking at?
Sure, I might have to grab my laptop because
Okay.
I have my notes on there, but stand by 1 second here. Let me get my to that page. Forgive me. So this gets into what I was talking about the qualified homes versus the net need, which is basically understanding the number of available parking spaces that are on a block face, especially when you have, you know, a stack of multifamily homes. Being able to understand how the parking spaces off street are currently being utilized. That's going to be very important when we start to talk about the qualified homes versus the net need, is to be able to understand, are all of the parking spaces being utilized? How many spaces are actually needed? And then your ability to basically simplify the model. So then we really talk about the ratio of 1 permit per address is something that we really are starting to talk about because again, we can't create inventory. So you've really got to model the number of parking spaces that are available off street, how they're being managed, and then ultimately what is the available resources that are on street. So that's really where the formula really comes into play to really understand. But the reality of not differentiating between single family and multifamily. Now, I'd love to sit here and talk to you about garage conversions and ADUs because those are also factors that we can't ignore. And the reality is today in the state of California, you are legally allowed to convert your garage and have it be a living space. You are legally allowed to create an ADU and in some cases, in most cases, not have to provide additional parking. So these are all factors that are things that are affecting Santa Ana today, which just means more people, in most cases, more cars. And so that's where the complexities of this formula really come into play. And that's why it's going to be really important that we really understand what the net need is by block face for folks that want to try to appeal into a parking permit program or establish a parking permit program.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand it because you have these complexes that are huge
Huge.
and you have like a tiny, like
Little
maybe block
block
and a
lots.
half.
Yep.
And so I'm just trying to understand the whole net need.
So, and that's where the reality, and this is why I wanted to be sure that we talked about shared parking today,
Mhm.
because even though I used to bring a parking magic wand to the meetings that many of you went to and you all used it very graciously, the reality is the magic wand is not real. And so the fact is we need to leverage available assets wherever we can. And maybe if one complex, the parking is underutilized, maybe there's an opportunity to tap the neighboring unit into those locations. So I mean, shared parking agreements can come in many, many shapes and many, many forms. I don't necessarily think that that's happening in Santa Ana today because I think that in general, the demand is the demand. But I do think that this is where we have to leverage nearby entities or available assets, privately and publicly owned, and try to bring those to the table. And then also figuring out how to move people around. Now, here's one of the challenges that we face in many communities. Those shared parking opportunities may not be conveniently located to where I live. And that's a reality of the world in which we live. And I think that that's where I think you'll find staff are identifying every opportunity of where there's available parking resources. But the challenge is we can't invent what doesn't exist. And I think that that's honestly going to be where the rubber meets the road of trying to find solutions where people are willing to park remotely, potentially jump on a bus or jump on a scooter in some cases for those who are able. I think that that's the reality of the world that we are living in.
Commissioner Reynoso, to try and answer the question, and I'll simplify it. Because in real life, it's not going to be this simple, but the premise is, let's say, we evaluated and we measured and 15 cars can fit. And we have a multi-family apartment complex and there's 5 dwelling units. We might say, well, since 15 cars can fit, each dwelling unit is entitled to 2 permit parking passes, right? The other way is maybe you can only fit 2 cars. And what we've done as a pilot that's going to be rolled into this is we have a lottery drawing, right? So that we can still offer whatever's available. But I can't give you 10 permit parking spaces for only 2 spaces that exist. We're not going to oversell the plane, right? And so it gets very complicated. And this is where I even say I defer to the math, to the team, because every neighborhood, you can imagine Willard or whatever is not that simple as I just described. So there's a lot that goes into it. And that's going to be part of the challenge, and that'll evolve over time as a new development project comes in and what have you, right? So anyways, but that's kind of the logic behind it.
Yeah, because I'm thinking like across the street where there's maybe 10 spots and it's a 360 unit complex.
Right.
How does that?
Oh,
The
Um,
reality of the lottery is it becomes so restrictive and honestly inequitable to the point of then why even have a lottery? I mean, that you kind of get to the point of where like, why have those types of permit restrictions at that point? And that's really why when we start to talk about trying to identify alternative locations to park, that's why there's no perfect solution. And I should also mention this, when we talk about these TOD developments, the reality is, like, we'd love to sit here and tell you that you're gonna be able to prohibit those new tenants or residents from buying into a permit program. But already we're facing civil liberties challenges in other cities that are trying to instill those rules. And already those challenges are being fought. So the fact is that the legislative changes that have happened that have basically eliminated parking minimums, they didn't come with any other rules associated with that. And so the reality is it becomes almost a free market type of scenario. And I'm afraid that by the time it makes it to the resident level, when these developments come into play, it's going to end up pitting neighbor against neighbor. And I'm sad for that, but that's what I'm honestly seeing throughout California.
Yeah.
It's not good.
Yeah, it just seems like definitely a shared contract for a lot of the
That's really
multifamily
the,
complexes is like the
Yeah.
only way to go.
it's a good neighbor policies and being able to identify those partners that want to participate. And then we as residents have to be good participants in the program and follow the rules so that we can continue that relationship with those shared agreements. It's worked in other states, it's worked in other cities. I have to tell you, for decades, this is how part in the city of Chicago, before cars were invented, before driveways were invented, we use school parking lots, we use church parking lots, we use bank parking lots, and everybody has figured it out. So I do think that those are the things that we have to incorporate here in California too.
Well, we're across the street from the city, so like
Yeah.
Commissioner
Yeah.
Alvarado suggested.
I think it's a
Walking
very good point.
distance.
Yep.
So
Thank
what-
you.
You all set?
If I could, Chair, before you
ahead.
finish up, I just had a couple follow-up questions.
Sure.
My first one's going to be directed towards city staff. So during this discussion, we came up on, how there are 3 agencies really that cover parking enforcement. We have code enforcement for vehicles parked on properties. We have PD for, cars that are blocking the public right of way. And then we have parking enforcement on the street. I would love to see if, there is some way to get more interagency communication going, whether that means, being able to have, because for residents, this is very difficult to determine as a layperson. Okay, well, I mean, that car is parked terribly. Shouldn't parking enforcement like be the one who tickets them? Like they're blocking the sidewalk on street sweeping day. It's so difficult and for any person to look at a situation and say, okay, this is the correct agency to call. And then you call someone and then it takes them so long to come out and respond to it. Is there any way that we can have interagency communication where, if the wrong agency is called out to assess a situation, they could take photos and send it to the correct agency. And then even if a warning is sent out to the, issuing, the owner of the vehicle or the owner of the property, whichever, I think that would go a long way in being a deterrent for continuing that behavior. As Julie was like talking in her presentation, the goal is not necessarily to find people, but to, encourage them to stop what they're doing. So I think that even if the wrong agency is called out, some sort of effort should be made to deter that from continuing. So I'd love it if you guys could work on that. It's just, as a resident who's been here for, almost 10 years, I didn't know this until I was here with you guys. And it's like, oh yeah, wow, okay. Now I know like all these complicated workings. Before it was just like, oh, you call someone and then they can show up and they're like, oh, I'm sorry, we can't do anything about that. And it's like, okay. Back to you, Julie. My last question for you, the license plate reading technology. So as we were discussing, in a lot of these residential areas, we are parked bumper to bumper.
Yep.
I myself, I'm from the East Coast. I parallel park into like the tiniest spots
Sure.
that my car should not be able to fit. And you can't see my license plate. How does the license plate reader get it?
So the plate reader has to be able to see the plate. I always say, camera can't see it, it can't read it. But I will tell you, surprisingly, it's pretty good at even picking up kind of those bumper to bumpers. But if you're tapping and there's no visibility to it, honestly, a lot of it goes into the parking enforcement officer and the pace at which they're driving. What's really unique about the LPR technology is it actually beeps and makes an audible sound as it can get annoying. I can tell you that it becomes secondary. It actually can identify, but it'll actually send a buzz if it misses a car too. So it causes the enforcement officer to kind of look and pay attention to see what the case is. Again, no system is perfect. And if it misses that car, it'll get it the next time too. So I think that that's the one thing is that, especially the folks that are maybe playing the system, and you might be doing that intentionally, potentially. A well-trained parking enforcement officer will usually give that car a second glance, and they can always manually check it themselves as well too. So there's opportunities around it. A lot of it kind of depends on work volume and, you know, how the evening's going. But the funny thing is, and I can tell you this from the graveyard, when we went out on a patrol, your parking enforcement officer surprisingly know most of the cars, which is no surprise to you. When you do a job, you get used to the plates and the cars. So it is something that really does stand out, and usually something the hairs on the back of your neck stand up and say, I need to pay closer attention to something. So it may just require them to interrogate it a little bit closer or manually enter the information.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Just a couple quick ones here. One is, what percentage of permit parking exists today versus non-permit parking?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. The percentage of permit spaces. Cointa, do you know that? You know that statistic, Cointa, do you? The percentage of permitted versus or Frank?
Great question from the standpoint of where we're talking. In other words, if you talk about, let's say, the east side, right, there's a lot of parking in the minute like that. You're talking about almost 85% actually permitted park spaces.
Right.
Versus non-permitted spaces. You talk about somewhere like the west side of the city, a little bit more north, it's almost a 50-50 break on the city, on the streets that are actually permitted. Versus streets not permitted. Now, the key question, the key answer to this one is, how many people are actually pulling permits on these streets varies in the areas as well. Where in more dense areas like east side, you're seeing 2 to 3 permits being pulled. With the less dense areas, you're seeing maybe 1 permit for each, 1 every 2 households pulling the permit. So if I can answer the question generally that way, if you want a specific location, you can get a little more.
I'll give you a more general. There's about 45,000 parcels in the city.
Okay.
How many permits do we issue? I think it's like 8,000.
Roughly.
So 8,000 divided by 45. 17%. But
Yeah.
I mean, just under 20.
One of the concerns I've had, because I didn't hear any discussion on it, is that an example is the lowest at 17th going north on in Floral Park. You go up north of that 2 blocks now because of permit parking. Why is there permit parking in there? Because across the street, 17th Street, is Willard. And Willard is predominantly apartments. And the fact is that at one point in time, the trend that was happening was landlords were not raising rent. They were charging parking for the people. So they had to have parking permits within that particular complex or building, whatever it was. And so what happened is that people got in their cars, and 5 or 6 people got in the car, they go across the street, they go up Flower Street. And people would just drop their cars off at night and pick their cars up in the morning. And it all happened. So what happened was it took almost 2 years to get taken care of by the permit process itself, because we had to get 100% acceptance for the permits to happen, and no deviation to that. And then, of course, convincing somebody why they should pay money for something they're not capable of controlling. And that resonated in many different ways. So, I mean, I'd like to make sure that there's something that kind of takes that into consideration also, because everybody's been talking a little bit about pricing and costs and everything else. Here's a situation where 50% of the neighborhood incurred a cost that wasn't their responsibility. and nothing was done to change that. So I think, I'd like to see something from the permits perspective, process perspective that would not necessarily make that particular situation go away,
Right.
but mitigate it in every way we can do that. No?
So, Chair McLaughlin, if I understand the question correctly, or the couple of points was, the percentage of people that had to vote, to initiate permit parking. Currently, our rules are, I think, 66%, and that's going to be changing in the new policy, I think down to 60%. The cost of the permit at the end of the day, my direction is very clear that the general fund cannot supplement any funding for this program. In other words, it's got to be a self-sufficient program. And when residential preferential permit parking is preferential, meaning otherwise it's public right of way and anybody can park wherever they like because it is a public space. So in order to effectively manage and provide for enforcement for the residential preferential permit parking where the residents vote in favor of implementing the parking, that fee has to be equal to the cost of running the program. And unfortunately, what we will be presenting is that it is an expensive program to run, especially when you add the enforcement charges to it. So I hear the concerns, and obviously, this talking about any sort of fee in the city of Santa Ana is not a popular topic, but it is definitely a fee that it is not imposed by the city unilaterally. It's there for the program if the residents wish to initiate and implement that program.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions, concerns? Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And before we go on, I'd like to make sure we note that Commissioner Reynoso was here at 5 o'clock today for the record. Okay, terrific. Thank you. I want to make sure we took care of that. Okay. Moving on to comments and updates from staff and commissioners. Are there any comments or updates from the staff members?
Thank you, Chair. A few updates, informational. So today was the first measurable significant rain event for us. So I welcome the water. We can definitely use it for our drinking water aquifers. So this is information for the commission and anyone listening. The city does have for rain events, free sandbag giveaway station at our city corporate yard located at 215 South Center Street. That's at the intersection of Center and First Street. We operate that extended hours, so 6:30 a.m. to 10 p.m. and any resident can come and load 10 sandbags with them. So any time there is a rain event, we open the station up. The update is we served 20 residents today for a total of 200 sandbags, and that will become available anytime there is another rain event going to happen. We are also in October, which is hard to believe, but we have a number of city, Halloween themed events. There is a police department trunk or treat event happening outside of the PD headquarters area, 60 Civic Center Plaza, October 16th, which is this Thursday from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. We are also at the Santa Ana Zoo having 2 Boo at the Zoo events, both upcoming weekends, October 18th, 19th, and October 25, 26. Just want to make sure that is Boo at the Zoo, not Brew at the Zoo. That's a different event. And then since we likely won't meet until December because November our ETAC lands on a holiday, I wanted to share that we are scheduled to have a groundbreaking ceremony for the Centennial Park expansion and dog park project. That is November 5th at 12:30. If you are able to join us, you'll see that we are well beyond groundbreaking. We are fully under construction, advancing on that project, but we never got an opportunity to hold a formal groundbreaking ceremony. So it's scheduled for November 5th. And lastly, as an FYI, our trash service contract, Republic Services, has moved into 1800 South Grand, which was the former offices of Waste Management. They are now fully moved in and have an office there. So for all of the multifamily and commercial accounts that pay their bills directly to Republic Services, if there are any issues, you can now walk in at 1800 South Grand to their customer service team and set up an account, resolve whatever issues may be there. And so that's very convenient. That's all I have. Thank you.
Any of the commissioners have any comments that they'd like to make at this point in time?
I'd like to make a request for a future presentation from you guys. This is actually inspired by a conversation I had with Zed recently at First Street Multimodal meeting. I would love to see a presentation from you guys on multimodal transportation. We have a lot of new things developing, e-bikes, hoverboards, electric scooters. I don't even know what else. I'd love to hear from you guys about these different things. I know that we don't specifically have a lot of codes enforcing these yet, but I know that other municipalities in the area do. So it'd be great to hear about potential enforcement of these, new modes of transportation that Santa Ana could implement. Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? All right, terrific. Then moving on, moving to meeting adjournment. The next regularly scheduled ETAC meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, November 11th, which is Veterans Day. No meeting rooms are available on November 12th, the following day. So we need to cancel this November meeting at this point in time. The next regularly scheduled ETAC meeting will occur on Tuesday, December 9th at 4 p.m. With that said, the ETAC meeting of October 14th, 2025 has adjourned at 6:06. What a record.
Great spot.